What would a month of decade reflection be without highlighting the bosses that define the era? Alongside my top 30 games of the decade, I'm here to keep things balanced with a deep dive into the most atrocious battles since 2010. Keep in mind that this list is solely my opinion, and I'm keeping the same rule from the top 30 best games of only one boss per game series plus no remakes. Specifically for this list, I want to shy away from the obvious choices. Duke Nukem Forever is so horrendous it makes me angry just thinking about it, but I'd prefer we didn't make this list a roll call for its bosses. Instead, I want to cast a spotlight on bosses from excellent games that stood out as terrible or disappointing, or even boss-related design decisions that affected a game as a whole. So be forewarned, this list will be far from conventional, and you're sure to see some games you and I both love featured. Without further ado, here are the biggest boss blemishes of the 2010s. In community-voted rankings we've held for the Souls series and its gothic horror counterpart, the bosses voted as worst often fall into two categories: too easy or bed of chaos. While I can't argue with the latter that we all know is a lock for today's countdown, speed bumps are far less offensive to me. Even if they aren't the most memorable or challenging, they often have clever tricks that are good for a passing giggle, add lore value, and let you channel your inner One Punch Man. They also provide a framework that sets the truly challenging bosses apart. The question we must ask is, why are they challenging? Do they have tight design, large move pools, heavy damage, small evasion windows, etc.? Are these features balanced in a way that pushes you to the limit yet provides fair opportunity for victory with proper strategy and execution? The answer will never be a black and white yes or no. Bosses fall somewhere on the spectrum from near perfection and balanced challenge to seemingly unfair or even broken mechanics that make us more likely to smash our controllers and claim victory. When I look back at Bloodborne as a whole, no boss fits the bullshit bill like Lawrence the First Vikon. I've read comments for ages condemning Lawrence, and if you're in that camp, here's the roast you've been waiting for. Let's take it step by step. Number 1, he has an HP bar larger than any non-Chalice boss, good for number 6 all time amongst Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, and Bloodborne. Number 2, he does some of the highest damage in the series with nearly all of his attacks, some with one-shot capability depending on your build. Number 3, his size and attack animations have varied timings and massive range that make them difficult to effectively dodge, especially when you consider their deceptive duration, which capitalizes on your counter frames for double damage. Adding these three together, you get an endurance battle thanks to high HP, but his high damage, range, and offbeat timings make the probability extremely high you'll take a hit at some point. If it doesn't one-shot you, it'll almost certainly two-shot you. This forces you to play defensively until you can heal, which is difficult due to the aforementioned damage, range, and timing, and will be exacerbated further by his gargantuan health pool, making it likely you'll be doing it more than once, making this a battle of attrition that has an astronomically high probability of you getting ass blasted before you get even the slightest whiff of victory. Your best bet is to set up shop under his booty and stick to it like glue. Many of his attacks will miss, but the trade-off is frequent sweeps that hit like a truck and have fire after effects. Oh, and don't even think about trying to run away because he's got arms that make Lanky Kong look like a T-Rex. His second phase has a trick where you can sit behind his left armpit to infinitely loop his backhand, but you have to dodge it perfectly every time, get back in the right spot, and only get a mere 1 to 2 hits before it comes swinging again. If you can't do that, pray for diarrhea, vomit, or luck because you'll need it to escape the Thunderdome unscathed. Outside of the difficulty scales tip 1,000 megatons out of your favor, Lawrence is also a flaming reskin of the first boss in the game. He does at least have an altered move pool, but he's haphazardly thrown into the DLC without much thought. It makes sense that he'd be amongst the Hunter's nightmare, but such a pivotal player in Yharnam's downfall deserved more than being built in the image of Cleric Beast with zero dialogue. You may think I'm being overly harsh, and even if you agreed with everything I said, you may think it's not enough to earn the title of 10th worst boss of the decade. Despite my intense adoration for Bloodborne, even I can see that Lawrence is a singular blemish on the best DLC of the decade. He stands out more vividly than the Witches or Blue Goobers for swinging balance grossly in the opposite direction, and Ludwig, Lady Maria, and Orphan of Kos all exist within the same DLC as excellent examples of tough yet balanced bosses. As for lore, it's a haphazard bow tie wrapped on a loose end. If this was their best attempt, it was better left on the cutting room floor. Number 9, The Imprisoned, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. You want to talk about fluff? Look no further than this bloated demon Muppet wastebasket. Make me suffer once, shame on me. Make me suffer twice, shame on you. Make me suffer a third time and I'm gonna pick up Groose like a baseball bat and smash my TV if the Wiimote doesn't get it first. I know Skyward Sword isn't everyone's favorite Zelda. While I may not share that opinion, I think we can at least agree Skyward Sword has some of the better bosses in the series. When the motion controls work, and they always did for me across 4 playthroughs for what it's worth, they opened another dimension of creativity that added great flavor to the boss roster. roster. The developers must have funneled it all into the rest of the roster because the Imprison shows up 3 times and gets progressively more antagonizing each go-around. Each fight is timed by way of the Imprison reaching the temple atop the sacred grounds. You need to skyward strike, a slash charge by holding the goddess sword to the sky for a moment, on the stake in his head 3 times before he reaches the top to win. This can be done by slicing up his bloated toes, but they hit you constantly with shockwaves, making it a chore. You can jump straight to his head from above, but it'll shake you off pretty quickly. The second time around, you can use the Gruesinator, yes, the Gruesinator, to stun him as he's now sprouted arms like the Frankenstein monster. The final time he takes flight, forcing you to enter the Gruesinator, a title that sounds more like a terrible 90s movie sequel than an intimidating weapon, and get blasted up to his head for the strike. The problems lie in how janky the mechanics can be, the margin for error being somewhat unforgiving, repeated battles being a chore due to how long they can take, and straight up failing to inspire an ounce of fuel to the fun factor. Its only value is as a narrative tool to add urgency to Link's journey, but the remainder is a stark contrast to a game with otherwise stellar bosses, making this dull affair a dud of the decade. Number 8, the Pantheon of Hallownest, Hollow Knight Godmaster. I'm stretching a bit outside the box on this one, but really you're getting multiple bosses for the price of 1. 42 in fact, which is kind of the problem. In Godmaster, a Pantheon is a boss rush. In a Pantheon, you'll face bosses one after the other, and eventually you'll get a breather in the form of a bench and a hot spring. A bench allows you to switch up your charms, which are the keys to your build, such as bonus health, range, damage, etc. The spring allows you to heal, which is vital since you'll be facing many more bosses before your next moment of reprieve. A unique bit of Hollow Knight that supports a boss rush is the healing system. In Hollow Knight, you gain soul when you hit enemies. Each 33% of those reserves can restore a single mask. This technically gives you a healing resource only limited by your own skill and your adversary's health. Soul can also be used for powerful magic, so there's a deep strategic trade-off involved. Even further in favor of the Pantheons, they add new and challenging forms of old bosses and a handful that are completely new. Finally, I'm a big fan of a brutally tough endgame challenge that rewards masochists willing to sink their teeth in. The 5th Pantheon more than fits that bill. With all of this in mind, the fatal flaw is a lack of balance. With lore and exclusive bosses locked behind a Pantheon of 42 consecutive battles that need to be defeated in one go to see all of the rewards, a huge chunk of the player base that love the game for its rich lore, exploration, and collectathon nature were alienated in its swan song. The time investment of reaching the final 3 bosses, who were widely considered to be the 3 hardest in the entire game, is roughly 40 minutes. So if you make it that far and lose against any of the 3, you've got close to an hour to attempt a single rematch. And that's assuming you can beat the other 39 without fail every single time. I've always complained about painfully long runbacks to bosses in games. Once you've conquered a level, the boss is the reward that cements the experience. I don't want to play the level again, I want to fight the boss. If it's a tough one, I want to be getting reps against it, not playing the level all over again. The repetition builds frustration, and that's assuming the boss battle isn't tiresome in itself. Personally, as long as I feel like the L's I'm taking are my fault more often than not, I can crack away all day. But the 5th Pantheon was too much even for me. That's because the runback in this case is the Pantheon. Say you lose to the 29th boss with a time of 31 minutes. That's another 31 minutes the game is asking of you for another attempt. And then you've got 12 more bosses to go. If you can't win, rinse and repeat until you pull off the improbable victory or go insane. The most frustrating thing is there's such a simple fix in-game. Make the benches actual checkpoints. That's their purpose the entire game, so it's not without precedent. Add in a death counter so there are 2 metrics, death and timer, for players who want to boast. You could even lock special charms behind a certain number of deaths as a reward to the most skilled, but let the story play out for those who are willing to grind from bench to bench, racking up astronomical death counts without forcing them to start from square one. At the end of the day, it's their game and they can design it however they like. You can also tell me and other players to get good, but when a measly 1.4% of the Steam player base has the achievement for beating the 5th Pantheon, that shows value in a middle ground. To me, it's not only a poor design decision worse than an individual boss being bad, it gates a large portion of the game's fans from experiencing bosses that are incredible. Count on seeing Hollow Knight on the best bosses list. The roster and its finest representative deserve it, and the game itself is spectacular. But for today, the 5th Pantheon ranks as a blemish on an otherwise phenomenal boss experience. Number 7, Gym Leaders, a decade of Pokemon. This decade saw the release of 4 more generations of Pokemon. The decade also saw an exponential increase in apathy toward Pokemon's stagnating formula. I'll state it outright. The Pokemon games are some of my guiltiest nostalgic pleasures, but the games haven't grown with me. There have been countless improvements to the battle system with the physical special split, abilities, held items, online play, the list goes on. Whether you're a fan of the flagship gimmicks such as Mega Evolution, Z moves, and Dynamax is a more divisive story. story. But as the battle format has seen consistent improvements, the trainer's journey hasn't followed the same trajectory. Each game's difficulty is a joke, and the gym leaders are my core issue. I can accept that youngster Joey is gonna throw his team of 6 Rattatas against a Machamp waiting to devour them. What I can't accept is gym leaders rarely bringing more than 3 Pokemon, often of the same type. I understand teaching new players early on about type advantages, but why does the typing theme continue the whole time? Is it tradition, or is it just babying the new players? That's weak, Game Freak. I remember getting obliterated by a cow rolling out over my entire squad as I stood there in awe with a smile on my face when I was 8. Using powerful Pokemon and strategies like this is almost entirely absent in the last decade. The most frustrating thing is solutions exist, and no, it's not making their Pokemon higher level. That's arbitrary difficulty. Playing a game of I'm gonna smash you with my numbers that are better than your numbers is mindless. Grinding your level isn't hard, it's boring. If you've ever dipped into competitive play, you know there are loads of creative strategies that make use of diverse typings and resistances, setup moves to sweep, status moves to gain advantage, defensive walls to stall, and wall breakers to plow through. The game has loads of nuance, and yet in the most recent entry I could enter a grass gym and know that I'd be mashing the A button on my fire starter to win without a single brain cell firing off. There are countless ROM hacks out there made by passionate fans that curate gym leader teams for an engaging challenge. If they can do it, why can't Game Freak? Post-campaign activities like the Battle Tower show you can give trainers a brain and a balanced team, so don't tell me you can't implement it into the main story. Look, I get that for many people this is all about the adventure and amassing piles of cutie pies, but with a viable solution, I don't see why there can't be a compromise for those who don't want a mindless battle experience. I have little doubt Game Freak will ever deliver the kind of experience I'm looking for, and maybe that's for the best to the majority of their market. But with this being my list, I'm taking the platform to say there's room for Pokemon fans who want challenge to have a better experience too. You just need to give us the option. Number 6, Heelys Horizon Zero Dawn. After being a thorn in your side for the majority of the game, Heelys delivers a boring, poorly designed battle that is disappointing to boot. I would say I was hoping our inevitable duel was going to be top notch, but the lackluster climax wasn't a big surprise. Horizon Zero Dawn's combat system fires on all cylinders when you're engaged in battle with robotic beasts. It's so good in fact that the human enemies feel bland in comparison, partially because of the great diversity and design of the cyber animals, but also how commonplace human foes are in gaming. Add in their simple mechanics that boil down to flailing around with basic arrows and melee, and it becomes a snooze fest. Heelys doubles down on that formula with basic melee swipes and bloating his HP to the thickest of heights. In other words, oversimplified, boring mechanics that outstay their welcome. Your objective is to play merry-go-round a square while shooting arrows in semi-auto, blowing fire canisters, or hitting him with your beating stick. There's so much momentum going into this fight, and while it does deliver narratively, the battle itself is awkward, disappointing, and outshined by even basic robot hunts. It's a random hiccup in a game with fantastic design overall, and definitely one of the more disappointing bosses of the decade. Number 5, Strike Bosses Destiny Year 1. Glorified bullet sponges. Now you could say, D-Mod, your first mistake was playing Destiny 1 Year 1, but hey, Atheon was dope even if he was afraid of fire. You have to wonder if a different development team created Atheon and Templar because it's an intricate battle of mechanics in their raid bosses versus mindless shooting into the HP void in the strikes. Raid bosses are tanky too, but you have earned damage windows through complex rolls for your teammates that make it engaging. Bungie got better about this over the years, but even in Destiny 2, we still had bosses that existed to soak up damage while basic enemies swarmed you. The worst of it was there were only 6 strikes in Destiny Year 1, and it was the primary way to get geared for the raid, so I had to suffer through the awful grind to get a chance to play the worthwhile content. It felt like a punishment, especially when...
Whether we wanted it or not, we've stepped into a war with the Cabal on Mars.
I don't know if my PS4 had a special glitch, but Valistark, the thickest boy of them all, was at least 90% of my strikes. It's supposedly random between the 6, but this obese war machine must have had a gravitational pull that kept yanking me back to Mars. And Destiny's Carrot on a Stick loot system gave me the psychological suck when Valis didn't, so I spent hours upon hours upon hours shooting BB pellets into Tark and his endless minions. There's nothing to his moves. He shoots missiles, he shoot gun, he slam if you get near him for an insta-kill. So you better stay back, manage ads, and tickle his health bar for that sweet blue loot. It was an awful grind that makes me shudder in hindsight. And these throwaway mechanic division bosses serve as a grim reminder of Bungie's emphasis on dangling loot sweet enough to mask the underwhelming experience underneath in Destiny's early days. To their credit, they've learned from their mistakes as time's gone on, and their raid bosses were consistently fantastic co-op boss experiences. But their lowlights are well deserving of a spot just inside the top 5. Number 4, Bed of Chaos, Dark Souls. For longtime fans of the channel, I'm sure you called this entry the moment you saw the upload. What may surprise you is its lack of top billing. If you're expecting me to have defensible reasoning as to why it's not the decade's worst, I don't. Meta Chaos is FromSoft's worst creation by far. There's not a single redeeming quality about it. In a game that is celebrated for its combat, they chose to emphasize platforming. With jumping limited to bunny hops that require a sprint startup, your room to maneuver is minimized by the crumbling floor, AoE magic, and arm sweeps designed not to whittle HP, but to shove you straight into a hole for an insta-kill. I suppose saying there's no redeeming factor is slightly unfair. Your one advantage is your progress in this puzzle is saved. So if you break the right shackle and die, you won't have to do it ever again. In fact, I would argue that it's easier to break a shackle, die, return, and start from the middle. Then at least you're cutting the route to the second shackle in half. At the end, it's a straight shot to the middle, hoping you can pull off the jump, and praying for no firestorm before you squash the bug in one hit. Every single mechanic in this fight either fuels frustration or is devoid of satisfaction. The true challenge here is a patience to persevere. Whenever I revisit Dark Souls, I always have the same experience. The first half from Asylum to Anor Londo is one of my favorite gaming memories of the decade. But outside of the DLC and Gwyn, the second half is an increasingly tiresome experience from New Londo ruins to Tomb of the Giants, culminating in the awful Demon ruins and Lost Izalith. The wretched core of this decline is the bed of chaos, and it would take a deliberate effort on FromSoft's part to create something this horrendous ever again. Number 3, Deathstroke, Batman Arkham Knight. I went back and forth for quite some time between Deathstroke and Bed of Chaos, but there were a few crucial factors that cement Slade in the top 3. First off, he plays second fiddle to the titular Arkham Knight, only showing up as sloppy seconds to fill the needed role of antagonist in the post-game while you complete the many tasks around Gotham. Whether or not you like the side content is subjective, but there's no arguing that there's an absurd amount of it. To face off against Deathstroke, you'll need to complete every last non-Riddler bit of it, and after hours of trash talk, he will finally agree to take you on, only to trot out in a tank. Are you kidding me? After all that effort, all that build-up, you slapped a reskin of the Arkham Knight battle as your reward in a series where this fight already exists. And here I thought this was some kind of battle against Deathstroke, not Joker, because this has to be some kind of sick joke, right? You wouldn't do this, Rocksteady. No, not you that created the brilliant Mr. Freeze battle in Arkham City. This is some Arkham Asylum Joker shit. This is some Arkham Knight tank shit. Literally. This is some Batman and Robin Mr. Freeze shit.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
I'd cringe at Arctic Plunge all day long over playing a game of cat and mouse in tanks against an assassin in a game that's at its best when you're preying on people from the shadows or pummeling them with your bat fists. I don't know what other reaction than boiling rage they would expect after I spent countless hours deactivating mines and raiding roadblocks. Just so I could have a flashback to the terrible Arkham Knight battle that Rocksteady clearly thought was so nice it needed to be ham-fisted in your ass twice. The cherry atop this shit sundae is once you deplete the tank's health, which is done by racing in circles until you get the dropping and fire a missile up its butt ad nauseum, he pops out ready to fight and Batman beats him with a single punch. What? Were you tuckered out from pressing buttons in the tank? How did this happen? How? You know, Rocksteady was a clever name for the studio. They were as steady as a rock when it came to quality throughout the Arkham franchise. Everyone has their hiccups, I get that. But despite fans' opinions on Arkham Origins, pretty much everyone agreed that Deathstroke battle was awesome. All you had to do was some variant of that. But instead, we get this lackluster garbage that is an insult to both Deathstroke's character and the player's time, making this travesty well worth a spot in the top 3. Number 2, Zora Magdaros, Monster Hunter World. Combine the complete shift away from the game's strengths with the Bed of Chaos fight and the complete disrespect for the player's time and satisfaction in Deathstroke and you get Bora. Get it? Because it's boring. Really. I don't think there's a single boss of the entire decade that lacks any semblance of fun like this oversized lava slug. It's the antithesis of fun. It's like the developers had a brainstorm session on how to make the most boring boss of all time and they cooked up the perfect answer. In a game centered around using various tools, weapons, and knowledge to hunt monsters for parts to make gear to hunt stronger monsters, you made the signature monster of that game one that takes advantage of absolutely none of that. You either play 15 minutes of inconsequential tower defense that could give a damn whether you do anything or not, and then you fight fire pillars that explode every few seconds in between long sequences of climbing around an artistically flaccid arena, and you have to do it multiple times across the game. I've never felt so useless and bored in a boss battle in my life. Monster Hunter World is fantastic overall, don't get me wrong, but design decisions like hunting footprints for hours and forcing multiple battles with a boss that is unlike anything else in the game in the worst way possible are such obvious bad design decisions that I can't believe they made it into the final game. There's more than enough content in the game to throw choices like that in the garbage, but while they are major annoyances, they aren't enough to detract from the overall experience, unlike our final entry. And the #1 worst boss of the entire decade, the Wraith Evolve. I warned you this list wouldn't be traditional by any means, and while choosing what is effectively a player-controlled boss may be a stretch, hear me out. For those who don't remember Evolve, I'll give a quick recap. From the studio that brought you Left 4 Dead comes a new asymmetrical multiplayer game with 4 hunters taking on a single monster. It was crowned by gaming media ahead of release as a game changer with groundbreaking gameplay unlike anything before it. Publisher 2K Games clearly thought the positive press had the game sales locked in, so much so that they thought it was a genius move to aggressively market DLC months before release. This ceremoniously flipped the script and had gamers and critics alike insulted that they thought it was okay to sell us additional content before the game even hit the shelves. Despite the large amount of day one DLC available for purchase and looming season pass, the game was still a commercial success, selling nearly 3 million copies in its first year. So you've got millions of players who bought in and DLC locked and loaded to force feed them. All you need is a satisfying gameplay loop to keep a healthy player base and you've got a slam dunk on your hands. That loop all starts with character selection. There were 4 hunter roles: the damage dealing assault, the supportive support, the team medic, and the monster tracker who would deploy a dome to trap the monster and force a fight. Then there were the monsters. Their role was to feast on wildlife around the map, evade the hunters, and evolve twice. Each evolution awarded extra HP, damage, and points to allocate toward unlocking newer, more powerful abilities. This should have created the perfect game of cat and mouse with the hunters tracking down and forcing the monster to fight in the early stages at a disadvantage and the monster employing creative evasion skills. That's the basic gist. I could go on for hours about all the different nuances and how this could possibly play out, but there's no need. Nuance didn't exist in Evolve. There was only Wraith. This was a monster that was designed to be stealthy, intended to pick off hunters one by one by isolating them. But in a misguided attempt to give the Wraith a way to defend itself since it had the lowest HP and armor of any monster, they created the Supernova. With one cast of Supernova, your basic melee hits received a modest damage buff. Not too bad, right? Sure, until you add in the 1000% attack speed increase. No, I did not stutter. 1000%. That's good for 10 times. You might say, well, that's asinine. That should have gotten laughed out of any discussions related to balance. But I'm just getting started. To fit the stealth motif, they also created a decoy. This would let the Wraith turn invisible and spawn a copy of itself. A copy that is invincible, can damage hunters, and is buffed by Supernova. That meant you could spawn a decoy that could attack the hunters while you also attack the hunters. This meant in a game balance for 1 versus 4 combat, you could do 2 on 4. Then there's the Warp Blast, an ability that lets the Wraith fly in a straight line from afar and explode for massive damage, blasting hunters back, disorienting their aim. All that nuance I was talking about? Irrelevant. Evolving to stage 2 without getting caught was trivial. That gives you 6 points to allocate between Decoy, Supernova, and Warp Blast, which is more than enough. Bait the hunters, Warp Blast in their face, cast Supernova, cast Decoy, and go ham until it's over. Unless the hunters played flawlessly, it was game over. A game that was intended to be played over multiple battles of attrition suddenly became an explosive clusterfuck that put the advantage handily in the boss player's court. It was so broken that you could use a Decoy and Supernova at stage 1 and ambush the hunters as they fell from their ship for an easy win. You'd spend more time in loading screens than playing the actual game. Because setting aside the grossly imbalanced design of the Wraith, consider that the player controlling the boss doesn't have to coordinate with anyone but themselves. Meanwhile, the 4 hunters had to play their roles and communicate flawlessly to survive. And your imagination can fill the lines in as to how well that went online. To summarize, a gaming community on the fence about gross DLC practices had a fraction buy in, and they were either playing the Wraith torturing newbies or were among those thrown into the fire. They lost over 90% of their player base in the first month. It was a catastrophic failure in the long term that went free to play a year later, only to be taken out like old Yeller in 2018 for failing to be worth the server costs. I was devastated this game was a flop. The concept of being able to step into the shoes of a boss was a dream come true for me, but the Wraith Supernova the player base out of existence. Dead by Daylight and even Friday the 13th would later prove there is demand for asymmetrical multiplayer, but the key difference in those games is that the hunters become the hunted, and have individual objectives to complete. Those games emphasize escape over combat, gave each player ownership over their own experience, and Dead by Daylight is thriving to this day with that formula. Evolve had a lot of issues externally, but for those that did buy in, the steep learning curve and coordination required for hunters was exacerbated immensely by how unbalanced the Wraith was on launch. The Wraith wasn't only one of the most unbalanced bosses of the decade, it handed the steering wheel to the players. You can't trust gamers with that kind of power, they're gonna troll people until their competition is dust. And that's exactly what happened. The Wraith destroyed the concept of a combat-oriented game centered around a player-controlled boss out of existence before it ever really began. For playing a major role in destroying an entire subgenre, the Wraith is my worst boss of the decade. But of course, that's just my opinion. I know a lot of people didn't play Evolve, so it's probably weird to have it at the top of the list, so be sure to tell me what your worst bosses of the decade are in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more of the decade's best, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I want to thank you all for watching today, much love to you, and I'll see you in the next video.